Giovanni Battista Viotti was a very key person in the development of violin art. He was an Italian violinist whose virtuosity was famed, and whose work as a composer featured a prominent violin and an appealing and lyrical tunefulness. A pupil of Gaetano Pugnani, Viotti could claim to represent the continuing tradition of Italian violin playing that started in the last quarter of the 17th century with Corelli. Pugnani had been a pupil of Somis, who in turn had been a pupil of Corelli. Ultimately, this would lead to the hourclass students as ultimate violinistic descendants of Viotti and Corelli, including the great Jascha Heifetz and the great Nathan Milstein, and their numerous students. We'll look at that violinistic family tree in closer detail a little bit later in the video. Viotti rose from a humble blacksmith's son to court musician for Marie Antoinette. And he bridged the classical and romantic eras. He composed some 29 violin concerti. He raised the profile of Stradivarius violins. He might have had a few affairs here and there with prominent ladies. And he was yet another composer-violinist of the 18th century who went from playing to royalty to dying in poverty, rather tragically. Which is quite sad for such a great man. You can actually go and see his 1709 Stradivarius violin, the Viotti, at the Royal Academy of Music Museum in London, which is usually open at set times on a Friday. I've made a video on this museum which you can locate within my Violin Pilgrimages playlist in this channel. And this violin Stradivarius got donated to the Royal Academy of Music as a tax pardon, or in lieu of inheritance tax. I actually attended a lecture around the time that the violin was donated to the Royal Academy of Music. And at the same time, I was privileged to attend the Vengerov masterclass, not as a student, but in the audience listening to him at the Royal Academy of Music as he gave instruction to the students. And then after that, Vengerov gave a recital during which he played the Paganini Cantabile amongst other pieces on the very same Viotti Strad that we had seen during the lecture that had just been donated to the museum. How I got to attend that amazing event is a story of itself. My teacher Ron, his nephew, was in fact a lawyer working for the Russians somehow, not in a kind of Russiagate type of way. This was obviously before Russia was alienated from the West like it is now. Again, he was either working as a lawyer within the Russian embassy or working for a Russian firm, but somehow the Russian embassy ended up gifting him 2 tickets to attend this event at the Royal Academy of Music, because I guess it was Vengerov who was in town, being a Russian player. These tickets were useless to Ron's nephew as he was not particularly that interested in violin, so they got passed on to Ron, and Ron invited me. So that's how I got to see this violin in the flesh for the first time, as well as attending a lecture all about the violin, and then seeing Vengerov perform a recital on it on the Viotti Strad. Whilst I was there attending the lecture before the recital, the luthiers at the Royal Academy of Music within their workshop were making a replica of the Viotti Strad, which they also showed us. I think the violin was in the white, if I remember correctly. So I digress a little to discuss the Viotti Strad, but we'll come back to Viotti's violins a little bit later in this video. But once again, he was among the first to raise the profile of the Stradivarius violin, and so Strads and Guarneri del Jesus ultimately began to take the place on the top of the podium, replacing the likes of Amatis and Steiners. Now, Viotti lived between 1755 and 1824 and was 68 when he died. So, he bridged the classical and romantic eras. The late classical period ends around 1820 and the early romantic starts at approximately in 1780. And so there is a crossover between these periods. Of course, Beethoven being the ultimate pivot from the classical into the romantic. So before we go into the detail of Viotti's interesting life, let's go through a brief timeline. He was born in 1855 and began violin at 9 years old. He was taken to Turin when he was around 11, ultimately to be instructed by Gaetano Pugnani. He served at the Savoy court in Turin between 1773 to 1780 before touring Europe with his teacher Pugnani and then going solo and heading out to Paris, ultimately to work for Marie Antoinette herself in 1782. Because of the French Revolution, he had to flee to London 10 years later, around 1792. He then fled to Germany near Hamburg in 1798 because he was accused in England of Jacobin activity, possibly stirred up by false accusations from a rival composer who was jealous of him. But by 1801 the climate had improved and he was back in London, back in Paris again in 1819, and back in London again in 1823, where he would spend his final year, dying aged 68 in 1824. He influenced many other composers, Paganini, Beethoven and Brahms, to name just a few. Next, let's look at his early life. He was born in 1855 at Fontanetto Po in the Kingdom of Sardinia, today in the province of Vercelli, Piedmont, Italy. He was the son of a blacksmith and amateur horn player. Viotti showed great musical aptitude at an early age and took violin lessons with a certain Signor Giovanni, learning to play the violin by the time he was about 9 years old. After the death of his mother, Viotti was taken to Turin by Marchesa di Voghera, the widow of Prince Dal Pozzo della Cisterna. For his musical talent, he was taken into the household of a Principe Alfonso Dal Pozzo della Cisterna in Turin, where he received a musical education that prepared him to be a pupil of Gaetano Pugnani. Viotti was around 11 years old at the time. Turin was a sophisticated musical centre, and Viotti studied with Signor Siloniat. Then, once Gaetano Pugnani had returned from London in 1769, Viotti became his student. He served at the Savoy court in Turin between 1773 and 1780, and then toured as a soloist, at first with Pugnani, which brought him to Switzerland, Dresden and Berlin, Warsaw, St. Petersburg and Moscow. An impartial observer suggesting that Viotti was in fact playing far better than his teacher Pugnani at this time. And around this time, Viotti's first publication, the Concerto in A, now known as the number 3, was offered for sale in 1781. While Pugnani decided to return to Turin after the tour, Viotti went on to Paris alone, where he made his debut at the Concert Spirituel on the 17th of March 1782. After many years of earning a low salary sitting near the back of an orchestra in Turin, his career took off in Paris, as he now had a job working for French royalty. He immediately found favour in Paris following his debut as a violinist in 1782, where he went on to become the court musician to Marie Antoinette at Versailles. Viotti had made a very strong impression with his playing, and once in the service of Marie Antoinette, he concerned himself with operatic administration. The Concert Spirituel of Paris was perhaps the most important stage for international violinists to perform on at the time. Pugnani had performed there in 1754, Antonio Lotti in 1764, and Giovanni Mani Giornovici in 1773, also known as Ivan Mani Janovic. However, nothing had prepared audiences for the mastery of Viotti's playing when he burst on the scene on the 17th of March 1782. people had never heard of such perfect talent before. No musician had ever had such a beautiful sound, consistent elegance, inspiration and variety that Viotti had. The imagination that shone through his concertos added to the delight that his playing stirred in the audiences. Viotti's violin works were as superior to anything ever written for this instrument as was his technique compared to that of his rivals. As soon as his fine music became known, the French violin school discovered wider horizons. In France, he established himself as a teacher and opera impresario. He was an instant sensation, serving at Versailles before founding a new opera house, the Théâtre de Monsieur, in 1788 under the patronage of Louis Stanislas Xavier, Comte de Provence and brother of the King of France. There he mounted operas of his friend Luigi Cherubini, among lesser lights. Viotti decided to remain in the French capital and quickly became a favourite of aristocratic circles and the court. He continued to play publicly for a year and a half and also regularly played in esteemed Parisian salons throughout the 1780s, as well as giving concerts at the house he shared with Luigi Cherubini, who was later to become the director of the Paris Conservatoire. Then he suddenly retired in 1783 and apparently entered the service of Marie Antoinette at Versailles, supposedly earning a substantial pension. Viotti turned entrepreneur and impresario when he entered into a collaboration with the Queen's perruquier, Léonard Autier, the creator of countless exotic and highly extravagant hairstyles. Viotti continued to compose concertos for the violin, and he aroused the interest of the king's younger brother, Louis Stanislas Xavier, Count of Provence. In fact, Viotti convinced him to establish a new performing venue, the Théâtre de Monsieur. First established in the Tuileries, the royal licence was granted for 30 years. Viotti staged French and Italian operas, French comedies and vaudeville, including works by his compatriot Luigi Cherubini. By all accounts, Viotti proved a vigorous and ambitious administrator, and the orchestra he assembled was considered the best in Paris. Rather interestingly, the origins of the French national anthem, although he was working for royalty, can be traced back to Viotti. In 1781, during his time at Versailles, Viotti composed his theme and variations in C major, which was copied in 1792 by Rouget de Lille and dubbed Song of War. The song was later adopted by volunteers from Marseille, and thus the Marseillaise was established, first becoming France's national anthem in 1795. It seems rather unfair that de Lille took all the glory. Then the French Revolution came along and changed everything for Viotti. When the French Revolution took a radical turn, and though his opera house was renamed the Théâtre Feydeau, as Viotti attempted to distance himself from the unpopular French royalty, nevertheless, former royal connections became a dangerous liability for him, and Viotti could see the writing on the wall. He had obviously been closely tied to royalty, and so began to fear for his personal safety. It was that in 1792 the French Revolution caused him to seek refuge in London. He fled to London in 1792 after his employer, Marie Antoinette, was arrested. He had not performed in public since 1784, but began playing again in London at the concerts organised by Johann Peter Salomon. His debut at Salomon's Hanover Square concert was on the 7th February 1793. He also developed a stellar reputation as a performer. Haydn was involved with some of these performances during his 2 visits to London in the 1790s. Viotti made a sensational impression playing his Stradivari violin in London. Viotti also continued to organise concerts and featured as musical director of the New Opera Concerts in 1795, the acting manager of Italian opera at the King's Theatre, and a leader and director of the orchestra, where he conducted Italian operas and appeared as soloist in his own violin concerti at the Salomon concerts. In London, he went from success to success as a featured violinist for Salomon's concert series, in 1793 and 1794 as musical director of the New Opera Concerts in 1795, as a star in the benefit concerts for Haydn 1794 and 95, as acting manager of Italian opera at the King's Theatre 1794-1795, and as leader and director of the orchestra in 1797. He was invited to perform in the houses of the London Bon Ton, including for the Prince of Wales. He had intended to remain in England and hoped to establish himself as a wine merchant. However, as Britain went to war with revolutionary France, Viotti was suspected of Jacobin activity and fell under suspicion. He was then denounced as a Jacobin in line with the Alien Bill of 1798 and accused, possibly at the encouragement of his rival Wilhelm Kramer. Indeed, period papers at the time hint at an intrigue in favour of Viotti's rival, Wilhelm Kramer, who had led the Opera House Orchestra before Viotti took over. Then, with Britain at war with revolutionary France, he was ordered to leave the country under suspicion of Jacobin sympathies. Philip Stanhope, the 5th Earl of Chesterfield, and Francis Osborne may also have been implicated in pushing for Viotti to be expelled. Pierre Rode, Viotti's favourite pupil, was also expelled from England and may have left the country some days previous to Viotti, who was awaiting the outcome of his case, after several gentlemen and even Princess Elizabeth had spoken in his favour. Finally, though, Viotti left England on a ship on the 8th of March 1798. He lived on the estate of a rich English merchant, John Smith, in Scheinefeld, Pinneberg, near Hamburg, from March 1798 to July 1799 approximately. Between March and May 1798, he gave private lessons to the 13-year-old virtuoso Friedrich Wilhelm Pixis. So his political exile from England took him to Germany for 18 months. But Viotti was able to return to London in 1801. He seems to have lived incognito on the estate of his English friends William and Margaret Chinnery at Gilwell House, where he lived officially from 1801. And he gave up giving concerts in order to attempt to run a wine business, but still continued to play in private concerts. Occupied chiefly with the wine trade, on his return he rarely played in public. Viotti set the wine merchant business up around 1801, stating, "I find that the English prefer wine to music." Perhaps that's why we have such few composers here. He inspired the new violin teaching techniques introduced at the Paris Conservatoire and the Royal Academy of Music. Unlike Paganini, who adored the limelight, Viotti was happier performing at smaller, more intimate gatherings. During this time, he continued to compose and to put on private concerts. Here are some contemporary comments from the time. Before Viotti began to perform his concertos, Her Majesty, with the most amiable condescension, would go round to the music saloon and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, I request you will be silent and very attentive, and not enter into conversation while Mr. Viotti is playing, for it interrupts him in the execution of his fine performance." This is according to the secret memoirs of Madame d'Orsay, lady's maid, to Madame de Pompadour, and of an unknown English girl and the Princess Lamballe. The masterly performance of Viotti exceeded all former sample. His power over the instrument seems unlimited. The grand mistake of musicians has been a continued effort to excite amazement. Viotti, it is true, without making that his object, astonishes the hearer, but he does something infinitely better. He awakens emotion, gives a soul to sound, and leads the passions captive. Morning Chronicle of March 12th, 1794. Viotti again produced the rapturous sensations he indeed possesses, not only sweetness, vigour, and every variety that the bone finger seems capable of affording, but he adds the grand ingredient soul, without which music is either insipidity, trick or noise. Morning Chronicle of March 26th, 1794. And so he devoted his energies to a wine business, still composed and played in private gatherings, visited old friends in Paris, and actually obtained full British citizenship in 1811. In 1813, he was one of the founders of the Philharmonic Society of London. He was elected director of the Philharmonic Society, but the failure of his wine business in 1818 left him seriously in debt. At this stage in his career, he played mostly as a chamber musician and orchestra leader. In July 1811, he became a naturalised British citizen after his friend, the Duke of Cambridge, a younger brother of the Prince of Wales, had interceded on his behalf. Viotti didn't perform as a soloist anymore, but as orchestra leader and chamber musician. After the failure of his wine business, Viotti returned to Paris to work as director of the Académie Royale de Musique from 1819 to 1821. He was in Paris as director of the Italian Opera up until 1822, after which he returned to London. He convinced his former Parisian patron to appoint him director of the Opéra and the Théâtre Italien in Paris, and had some success with Rossini's Opera Buffa. In 1823, he was compelled to relinquish the position of director of the Paris Opera, and then he returned to stay with friends in London. He was a director of French and Italian opera companies in Paris and London. He personally knew Joseph Haydn and Ludwig van Beethoven. Viotti visited Switzerland in 1792 after his brother died, where he was exposed to the sound of the Orange des Vaches, or Kuhreihen, which is a work song traditionally played on the horn by the Swiss alpine herdsmen as they drove their cattle to and from the pasture. He published an extended description of first hearing this piece of music, his favourite encore. My entire being was struck by such sounds, some precipitate, some long and sustained, which arose from one crag and flew across to another without being repeated by the echoes. It was the sound of a long trumpet. A woman's voice was blending with its sad sounds, soft and sensitive, forming an exquisite unison. Overwhelmed by such enchantment, I pulled myself together, shaking myself out of my lethargy. Shedding a few tears, I sought to engrave this Orange des Vaches on my memory, and that is what I am communicating here. Did Viotti have affairs? The violinist and composer Giovanni Battista Viotti is documented as having a very close unconventional living arrangement with the wealthy English couple William and Margaret Chinnery, which has been described as a remarkably successful ménage à trois. Viotti's biographers have also noted friendships with other prominent women of his time, such as the painter Madame Vigée-Lebrun and the educator and novelist Madame de Genlis. Viotti spent his final years in London, where he died in poverty, unable to repay his debts to the Chinnery family who had befriended and supported him. He had returned to London in November 1823 together with Margaret Chinnery, and died a year later in her presence on the 3rd of March 1824. The famous Italian violinist and composer was buried in the St Marylebone and St George's burying ground in London, England, specifically in vault number 6 under Paddington Street. He died in debt, disillusioned and dejected. Viotti was a very influential violinist, the teacher of both Pierre Rode and Pierre Baillot, and an important influence on Rodolphe Kreutzer, all of whom became notable teachers themselves. He is considered the founding father of the 19th century French violin school. He also taught Paul Alde and August Duranowski, who was an influence on Niccolo Paganini. Let's have a look at how Heifetz could trace his violinistic family tree back to Viotti, and even as far back as Corelli. Hey guys, I've just been doing some of my Heifetz research of late and looking specifically at the violinistic family tree, or the violinist family tree, if you will, from Heifetz to Auer and going back. Now I'm starting from Heifetz and working back because this is quite interesting and has revealed some quite interesting surprises to me. So we have Heifetz, then we get to Malkin, who was Heifetz's first teacher after his father, and Auer. Now, Malkin was a student of Auer, but Heifetz was, of course, a student of Auer because he was in the famous Auer class. It was Malkin who recommended Heifetz to Auer. And then, if we continue up, we've got Joachim and Dont, obviously famous violinistic names, and this Stanislav guy, whose surname I won't try and pronounce, who I think he was taught by his father. But then Dont's teachers were Joseph Böhm and Georg Helmersberger. Again, Georg was also a student of Joseph, and both taught Dont, it would seem. This is where it starts to get really interesting. Rode, as in the Rode Etudes, famous violin name. Viotti, super famous violin name. And there we have Antonio Celoniat and then Gaetano Pugnani. That name I recognise from Fritz Kreisler's In the Style Of composition. And Giovanni Battista Sommis, and here's where it gets super amazing. Arcangelo Corelli, the father of violin himself. The father of violin playing. So, in the Heifetz violin family tree, his heritage goes back, all the way back to Corelli via Joachim, Dont, Rode, Viotti. Compositions of Viotti. Viotti greatly developed the violin concerto using the sonata form and a skilled orchestration. His 29 violin concertos fully reflect his musical imagination, his power as a performer, and his development as a composer. He also wrote at least 10 piano concerti, some of these are transcriptions of the violin concerti, as well as string quartets and other chamber works. Viotti's most notable compositions are his 29 violin concertos, which were a major influence on Ludwig van Beethoven. One in particular, the number 22 in A minor of 1792, is still very frequently performed, especially by advanced student players. The other concertos are of similar quality but lesser known. Other notable concertos include the number 23 in G major of 1792 also. During the decade of 1990 to 2000, Guido Rimonda found 3 more concertos. However, these discoveries that can be regarded as concertos numbers 30, 31 and 32 are incomplete, since only 2 movements were found for each concerto. Most likely they are the unpublished concertos mentioned by Viotti himself in his will, all left in favour of Mrs. Chinnery, who cared for him in London in the last years of his life. Now let's talk about Viotti's violins and see my video dedicated to this subject. Viotti owned a violin fabricated by Antonio Stradivari in 1709 that would eventually become known as the Viotti Stradivarius. He is also thought to have commissioned the construction of at least one replica of this violin, the Viotti ex Bruce, renamed in honour of its previous owner, was purchased by the Royal Academy of Music in September 2005. Funding was provided by HM Government in lieu of inheritance tax and by the National Art Collections Fund, the National Heritage Memorial Fund and many private donors. The instrument was to be displayed in the York Gate Collections, the Academy's free museum and research centre. The Viotti X Bruce is to be heard as well as seen. The instrument is to be played sparingly under very controlled circumstances, at research events and occasional performances elsewhere. As I mentioned, I had the privilege of hearing Vangeroff play a recital on this violin. There is also a vintage recording of Raff's Cavatina by violinist Pauline Hall, playing on Viotti's Strad in 1912. Viotti was the first significant virtuoso to popularise the modified Stradivari violin and the taut model bow. His own playing instrument was a Strad of 1704, possibly presented to him by Catherine the Great of Russia in 1781. Viotti had strong, but not always reliable, business instincts. He was a wine trader after retiring from performing life. And he also endorsed and sold other instruments to admirers. Before Viotti, earlier players had favoured Steiner model instruments, which are noted for their mellow tone and good blending qualities, but which don't project their sound as clearly as instruments from Cremona, and particularly those made by Stradivarius. By the late 1780s, J.J. Merlin was improving old violins to bring them up to Cremonese standards. The Viotti X Bruce violin has a fine one-piece back with vivid tiger stripes. The original finish of its varnish is exceptionally well preserved. The name Bruce is in honour of its most recent private owner. It was acquired by HM government in lieu of inheritance tax, with additional funding from a whole bunch of people listed here. Viotti is commemorated annually in the Viotti International Music Competition near his birthplace in Vercelli, Italy. In conclusion, his career as a performer was relatively short, but his influence on violin playing was very considerable, witnessed notably by the younger generation of players that included Rod, Kreutzer and Bayer. He spent his final years in London, where he died in poverty, and probably he was the most influential violinist between Tartini and Paganini. Viotti represented the last great flowering of the Italian tradition originating with Corelli, and is considered the founder of the 19th century French school of violin playing. Of course, Paganini would come on the scene and revolutionise violin playing once more. Viotti was apparently an attractive and forceful person, and some small measure of his extraordinary influence may be credited to the strength of his personality. He was able to form lasting friendships with influential people, and he was adored by his students and younger contemporaries. However, during this period of social instability and shifting values in music in which he lived, Viotti was not satisfied with a career as a composer virtuoso, a field which harboured his greatest talents. Perhaps he could see the danger of being too dependent on raw patronage, something that Haydn and later composers were able to emancipate themselves from. Viotti enjoyed a dazzling career as a soloist and was particularly admired for his brilliant technique and talent to sing the melodies in the slow movements in a bel canto style. As a musical journal wrote, he plays with a large, strong, full tone in the first movement, the combination of this with a powerful, penetrating, singing legato in the second, as the third, variety, charm, shadow and light is brought into play through the greatest diversity of bowing. We know that Mozart, Spohr and Beethoven showed interest in Viotti's works, and that Paganini had Viotti compositions in his concert programs. Viotti was 27 years older than his more famous and infamous compatriot Paganini. Indeed, their lives overlapped by 42 years. Paganini was born in 1782 and Viotti died in 1824. Viotti's famous Concerto No. 22 in A minor was a favourite of Johannes Brahms, who revived it in the 1870s. It is still frequently performed, Brahms, admiring his work, used some artistic license from it in his own violin concerto. Viotti was a key influence in the lives of many violinists and composers, and in Paganini's case, indirectly via his pupil August Duranovsky. Beethoven himself drew inspiration from his violin concertos. He met and knew Joseph Haydn, meeting him for the first time in London in 1794. And Haydn's musical influence can also be heard in Viotti's later concertos.